It was an unusually quiet morning for a Thursday, and I was just finishing up a routine security check at the local gas station. The sun was barely up, and the streets were still empty, save for a few early risers. I adjusted the straps on my military-grade uniform, feeling the weight of the gear against my skin. My boots clicked against the pavement as I walked, my eyes scanning the area for anything out of the ordinary. I never expected to be in the center of a scene like the one that unfolded. Out of nowhere, two white police officers pulled up in their patrol car. At first, I thought they were just here for a quick chat or some routine inquiry. But the moment they stepped out, the air shifted. They didn't look like they were here for anything casual. Their faces were stone cold, their eyes locked onto me in a way that made my stomach churn. "Ma'am," the taller officer said as he approached, his voice formal but with an edge of suspicion, "we need to ask you a few questions." I raised an eyebrow, trying to stay calm. "Questions about what?" He didn't answer directly. Instead, he moved closer, his partner standing behind him, hands resting on his belt. They circled me, clearly sizing me up as though I didn't belong in that uniform. I straightened my back, holding my head high. It wasn't the first time I'd been questioned by someone in authority, but the way they were acting felt different. "Is everything all right, officers?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. They didn't answer. Instead, the officer closest to me gestured for me to turn around. "You're coming with us for questioning," he ordered. I felt the cold snap of handcuffs locking around my wrists before I could say anything else. My heart raced, but I kept my composure, refusing to show weakness. The last thing I wanted was to escalate the situation. The officers didn't speak a word as they guided me toward their patrol car. The grip on my arms tightened, and I could feel the cold metal of the cuffs biting into my skin. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. I had no idea what they were accusing me of, but I knew one thing for certain: this wasn't right. As we reached the car, the taller officer finally spoke. "You're under arrest for suspicion of something." He trailed off, as if trying to come up with a reason. But he couldn't find one, and the words hung awkwardly in the air. "Suspicion of what?" I asked, keeping my voice as calm as I could. He didn't answer. Instead, his partner, who had been quiet until now, muttered something under his breath. I caught the words, "too much," but I couldn't make out the rest. I stood there, my back straight, my eyes unwavering. There was a fire burning inside me, but I refused to let it show. I wasn't going to let them control the narrative. As they shoved me into the back of the patrol car, I noticed a few people had started to gather at the gas station, watching the scene unfold. Their faces were a mix of confusion and curiosity. I didn't blame them. This wasn't a normal traffic stop, and it wasn't just any random person being taken into custody. It was me, a black woman in uniform, and for some reason, that seemed to be all they cared about. The officers climbed into the front seats, and the car pulled away, leaving the gas station behind. I stared out of the window, watching the streets blur past, but my mind was far from where we were going. My thoughts were on the phone call I knew I had to make. I needed to get in touch with someone who could stop this madness. Someone who would know exactly what was going on here. I reached for my phone, carefully hidden in my pocket, and dialed the number I had memorized years ago. There was no time to waste. As the phone rang, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change, and the officers had no idea what was coming their way. The phone rang 3 times before it picked up, and I breathed a silent sigh of relief when I heard the voice on the other end. "Talk to me," the voice said, calm and steady. "Hey, it's me," I replied, my voice low. I could hear the subtle tension in my own words. "I need a favor. Fast." I could almost hear the sharp intake of breath on the other side. "What's going on?" I quickly explained the situation, the 2 officers who detained me without cause, the vague accusations, and the way they were handling me. "I'm in the back of a patrol car right now, and I don't know what the hell is going on. I need you to make some calls." This isn't just some routine stop. There was a brief pause, and I could almost feel the wheels turning as the person on the other end processed my words. "All right," they said after a moment. "Stay calm. I'll get in touch with the right people. You're not alone in this. We'll get them to stop." I exhaled slowly, the weight of their words settling in. "Thank you. And make it quick." The line went silent as they hung up, and I placed the phone back in my pocket. The officers, unaware of the call I'd just made, continued their drive. The car's engine hummed steadily as we rolled through the empty streets, the rhythmic sound almost comforting. But I could feel the tension building inside me. It wasn't just about being detained anymore. This was bigger. I couldn't help but wonder what had triggered this moment. Was it the uniform I wore? The way I carried myself? I had never been afraid of authority before, but there was something about this situation that felt wrong on a level I couldn't quite explain. I turned my head slightly, catching a glimpse of the officer in the passenger seat. He was glancing at me through the rearview mirror, his eyes flicking back and forth nervously, as if unsure of what to do next. I didn't give him the satisfaction of acknowledging him. I wasn't about to make this easy for them. They were going to realize, sooner or later, they had messed with the wrong person. We had been driving for what felt like an eternity, the silence between us growing heavier by the minute. The officer in the passenger seat kept glancing at me, clearly unsure about how to handle the situation. His partner, who had been driving, didn't speak a word. The only sound was the hum of the engine and the occasional crackle from the radio. Then, just as I was starting to think they might take me to the station, the car slowed down. The driver, a shorter officer with dark, wiry hair, turned the wheel, pulling off the main road and down a side street. My pulse quickened. This wasn't where they were supposed to be taking me. I could feel the pressure building inside me, like I was on the edge of something I couldn't quite predict. I knew I had made the right call by reaching out, but something about this felt like it was escalating into something I couldn't control. I pressed my back against the seat, my eyes on the rearview mirror, as the car rolled to a stop in front of a small, nondescript building. A warehouse. My stomach churned with unease. This wasn't right. My instincts were screaming that I was being taken to the wrong place. The officers opened the doors, and the passenger officer came around to my side of the car. He wasn't as calm as before. There was a slight shake in his hands as he unclicked my seatbelt and motioned for me to step out of the car. "Get out," he ordered. I stayed still. "Where are we?" "You're not in any position to ask questions," he snapped, his voice tight. I could feel the weight of their misunderstanding, but I wasn't going to play along. "I'll get out when you tell me why you're taking me to a warehouse," I said, my voice steady. This is far from a typical arrest. The tension was thick in the air, and I could see the doubt creeping into the officer's eyes. He hesitated, his grip on my arm faltering for just a second. That was all I needed. I felt my phone buzz in my pocket, a small but significant reminder that help was on the way. I glanced down, my heart pounding, knowing that one more move could change everything. "Let's just get this over with," the officer muttered, his patience clearly running thin. But I wasn't moving yet. I needed to see this through. Before I could speak again, the buzz of my phone grew louder, and the officer's face turned pale. His gaze snapped back to the rearview mirror again, his lips parted in disbelief. The color drained from his face. The call had been made. And something was about to shift, fast. The officer's face had gone pale, and I couldn't help but notice the way his hands shook slightly as he fumbled with the door handle. He was trying to hide it, but the sudden shift in his demeanor wasn't lost on me. It was like the situation had turned from something routine into something far more dangerous for him. I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. My phone buzzed again in my pocket. This time, the message from my contact was clear: help is on its way. "Stay put." "Is there a problem, officer?" I asked, my voice smooth, almost mockingly casual. He didn't respond at first. His partner, who had remained silent this whole time, finally glanced over at him, his expression changing from confusion to something else. It was as though the moment had shifted from one of power to one of fear. "What the hell is going on?" the passenger officer muttered under his breath, but it was too quiet for me to fully hear. "Don't worry," I said, my eyes locking on his. "You're not going to have to worry about this much longer." The tension in the air was palpable. They both seemed to be realizing, all at once, that something was about to change, and it wasn't in their favor. As if on cue, I saw a black SUV pull up just down the street, the engine shutting off with a distinct growl. My heart skipped a beat, and the officer's eyes flicked nervously toward it. 2 more officers in plain clothes stepped out of the vehicle, moving toward us with purpose. The first officer who had been detaining me looked from them to me, his mouth opening as though he was about to say something, but the words never came. His voice had completely failed him. I watched the 2 plainclothes officers approach, their movements quick and decisive. One of them flashed a badge, FBI. My pulse quickened. They had arrived. And the officers who had detained me were about to learn a lesson in just how big a mistake they had made. The officer in the passenger seat finally spoke, his voice shaking. "What's going on here? We're just doing our job." The FBI agent didn't flinch. "Your job," he said coldly, "was to make an arrest based on actual suspicion, not on a hunch, and certainly not by treating someone like they don't belong. You're about to find out what happens when you overstep." I stood still, my wrists still bound, but now I could feel the power shift. I wasn't the one on the receiving end anymore. The other plainclothes officer, who had been watching the scene unfold, pulled out a phone. "We've got everything we need," he muttered, speaking into the phone. "Bring in the paperwork. These 2 are done." I could see the panic in the eyes of the officers who had detained me. The realization was sinking in that the call I had made wasn't to some random contact, it was to the people who could end their careers in an instant. The 2 officers' faces had gone from defiant to terrified, their bodies stiff with the sudden knowledge that they were now at the mercy of the system they thought they could control. And there was nothing they could do to stop what was coming next. The scene had shifted from one of tense uncertainty to one of quiet, inevitable reckoning. The 2 officers who had detained me were standing in place, their faces pale and their shoulders stiff. The realization that they were about to lose everything, careers, reputation, everything they'd worked for, was settling over them like a thick fog. The plainclothes FBI agents didn't waste time. One of them, the one who had spoken earlier, approached the taller officer who had arrested me. He flashed his badge again, then pulled out a set of papers, handing them to him with a firm gesture. "You're being detained for misconduct and abuse of power," the agent said, his voice cold. "You'll both be taken in for questioning. The process has already begun." The taller officer opened his mouth to protest, but the words died in his throat. He took the papers slowly, as though he could barely comprehend what was happening. I stood quietly, watching as the agents moved with military precision, cutting off every potential avenue for escape or explanation. The second officer, the one who had been driving, didn't even attempt to resist. He just stood there, his eyes downcast, his body language signaling defeat. "Where are the rest of the arresting officers?" one of the agents asked, his voice sharp. "There were no other officers," the passenger officer said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It was just us." The agent nodded, and without another word, he turned his attention to me. His face softened slightly, but there was no sympathy in his eyes. This was business, nothing more. "You can go now," he said to me, unlocking the handcuffs with a simple twist of the key. The cold metal fell away from my wrists, and I flexed my fingers, feeling the relief surge through me. The other FBI agent approached and handed me a phone. "You'll want to make a call," he said, his tone matter of fact. "You've got a lot of people who need to hear about this." I took the phone from him, my heart still racing, but this time, it wasn't from fear. I dialed the number I knew by heart. It only rang once before a familiar voice answered. "They're done," I said, my voice steady but carrying a weight that couldn't be ignored. "It's over for them." There was a long pause on the other end before the voice spoke again, this time with a hint of satisfaction. "I knew it would be. Get home safe." I clicked the phone off, slipping it back into my pocket. The FBI agents, once focused on me, now turned their attention fully to the officers. It was clear they had already made their judgments. The officers had been outclassed from the start, and the consequences of their actions were unfolding quickly. The sound of approaching sirens grew louder as additional vehicles pulled up, and the agents moved to the side to make room for the incoming backup. I turned and took a step toward my own vehicle, the weight of everything that had just transpired settling heavily on my shoulders. But I wasn't done. I would make sure everyone knew exactly what had happened. What was about to happen to those officers was just the beginning. As I walked back to my car, the officers' fate began to sink in. The entire scene had shifted from one of frustration and fear to one of grim justice. The faint sounds of distant sirens, the scuffling of boots, and the steady murmur of voices filled the air, marking the conclusion of a chapter one hadn't expected to unfold this way. I slid into my seat, taking a moment to collect myself. My hands, still a little stiff from the cuffs, gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles whitening. But I wasn't rattled anymore. I knew that what I had just witnessed, the way those officers' lives had been upended in an instant, was a consequence of their own choices. They had underestimated me, and now they were paying the price. I looked up to see the FBI agents standing near the warehouse, talking to their team, gathering evidence. The officers who had detained me were now being handcuffed themselves, their heads hung low. They were no longer in control. They had lost everything. The power they had once wielded in their uniforms had evaporated as quickly as it had appeared. I started the engine, the rumble beneath me signaling my departure from this chaotic chapter. But as I drove away from the scene, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. There would be investigations, hearings, and news reports, but this was just the beginning of something bigger. My phone buzzed again. I glanced down and saw a message from the same contact: "They won't be back on the force. You made the right call." I couldn't help but exhale a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. It wasn't about revenge. It was about standing up to the abuse of power. About proving that no one, not even the most powerful, was above the law. But there was more. I couldn't rest until I made sure that what happened today wasn't forgotten, that those officers' misconduct wasn't just swept under the rug. Their careers were ruined, but I knew that justice would be fully served only when everyone who needed to know understood exactly what had taken place. I pulled over to the side of the road and made another call, this time to a journalist I'd worked with in the past. "I've got a story for you," I said, my voice steady. "You'll want to hear this." As I hung up, I felt a flicker of satisfaction. The wheels of justice were in motion, and this time, there was no stopping them. Those officers had thought they could detain me, put me in my place. But they had no idea who they were dealing with. As I drove off into the distance, I felt a sense of finality. The next steps would be out of my hands. But I had done my part. And the world would know the truth. The weeks that followed felt surreal. The news outlets had picked up the story, but not in the way anyone had expected. The media was flooded with reports of two officers who had abused their authority, detaining a black woman in uniform without cause. The headlines were everywhere, and the public outcry was swift. The country was watching. The officers were placed under immediate investigation, and soon, the details of their misconduct began to emerge. It wasn't just that they had wrongfully detained me, there were reports of similar incidents, where they had targeted others without proper cause, using their badge to intimidate and harass. The truth had finally come to light. The FBI's involvement, the paperwork they'd gathered, and the undeniable evidence stacked up against the officers ensured they would never return to their jobs. Their careers were officially over, but the damage to their lives went far deeper than that. Their names were dragged through the media, their reputations shattered. No amount of legal wrangling could undo what had been done. For me, there was no real closure. I wasn't seeking revenge, I had only wanted justice. I wanted to show that no one should feel afraid because of the uniform they wear, the color of their skin, or the power someone else thinks they hold. And when the system fails, there are still people willing to step in and correct it. I sat back in my apartment one evening, watching the news coverage unfold. There were interviews, protests, and public debates. My face appeared briefly on the screen, but I knew this wasn't about me. This was about something much bigger. A ripple had started, and I hoped it would go further. The phone call I had made on that day, the one that had started it all, was the pivotal moment. It had been a simple call to the right people at the right time. But it had turned into something far more significant, a signal that the fight against injustice would continue. I took a deep breath and stood up, walking toward the window. The sun was setting, casting a soft glow across the city. For the first time in a long while, I felt a sense of peace. I had done my part, and the story had been told. The consequences had come swiftly for those who thought they could misuse their power without fear of reprisal. And while it wasn't over, it felt like a turning point. I smiled to myself, knowing one thing for sure, I'd be ready if and when this kind of injustice reared its ugly head again. Because, just like that day, when it did, I wouldn't hesitate to make the call. And when that call was made, things would change. For good. And that was the end of one chapter, but the beginning of another.